Yeah, thanks, Peter, for joining us here at WU for quite a number of weeks as a visiting professor. And actually, can you tell us a little bit more about the university you are currently employed at?
Yes, I'm at the University of New South Wales, Australia, formerly known as UNSW Australia. It's in Sydney, and it's one of the group of 8 universities in Australia. So there's UNSW and University of Sydney are the 2 Sydney-based ones, and they're kind of the premier universities in Australia.
So the group of 8 would be this kind of
Yeah,
collection
so like
of...
official designations of,
Okay, excellent.
of the better universities, yes.
Mm-hmm. And since when are you there?
Well, I started studying there in 1989.
Oh.
I started studying psychology, philosophy and sociology, and after 3 years of that, I learnt that I'm not very good at deciding what I want to focus on, so I took majors in all 3 of them. But then I needed to make a choice, so I did honours and a Master of Psychology, and that led me to work at KPMG, an area that I was quite naive about. I sort of went in and said, well, what do you do? Well, you don't go to a firm like KPMG and say, what do you do? But I learned, of course, they're mainly an audit firm, but I worked in career navigation. So I was working and helping people who'd just been outplaced to work out what they want to do in their careers. And as part of my master's, I took some courses at the Australian Graduate School of Management. And one class I took on managerial decision making with Bob Wood, I found particularly interesting, and I suggested a reading that he might like to consider to supplement one of his lectures, and that was quite an atypical thing to do, but the net result of that was that he invited me to do my PhD with him. And so that was it was a cool thing, because I'd never really thought of being an academic, but he put the idea in my mind and I took it up, and so I began my PhD there and then finished it in Toronto with Gary Latham. Had 7 years in Dallas, Texas, working with Don van der Walle. And then decided for family and other reasons to go home. So now I'm back at the university where I studied.
Excellent. So that sounds like a kind of very, very thorough plan to go to academia, or
no,
not
I don't
really?
think so. I think there's always been an abiding interest in good and useful ideas, and being an academic seemed at the time, and has turned out to be, a very good forum for thinking, learning about ideas, learning what's been well researched, what could be truly useful, and trying to create and add to the body of knowledge about those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I mean, looking back at those years in academia in hindsight, and kind of having potentially new young academics in mind, is there anything you would say that's something I'd really like to pass on to these new academics, a kind of lessons learned, or kind of stay away from, or kind of for sure do make sure that, or something like that? Is there anything you can share?
That's an interesting thought. I have been musing about something somewhat for the last decade, and that is a core issue that emerged in a special edition of Career Success. I guest edited with Hugh Guns, and in that there was a paper by Tim Hall, who's of course very famous for his ideas on self-directedness and being values-based, and the basic idea that what we need to do in our careers is work out what our biggest dreams are and go and pursue them. And of course that's very big in popular literature, and he has research on his protein career about that. Then there was Nigel Nicholson presenting a neo-Darwinistic, look, it's a zero-sum game, dog-eat-dog world out there, so what you've got to do is understand the ropes and play the game, or you'll fall off the back of the wagon. And they're so diametrically opposed, and I often thought there's probably a degree of truth to both of them, but I'd never really thought about how they might be reconciled. And an idea with regard to that, which is something I wish the younger me had known, but I had the opportunity to think through and share with the PhD junior faculty here a couple of weeks ago, was brought into sharp focus by bathroom sign I saw for sale in a store in New York, which said, "You don't have to brush all your teeth, just the ones you want to keep." And what this brought to mind is, it's nuts to become obsessed with the rules of the game and how to get into this journal and what's the hot topic you've got to go and publish on. On the other hand, too much follow your dreams, find your own way. You could either, there's a very real risk of not actually getting a seat at the academic table. So over the last few years at the Academy of Management, when I hear professional development workshops, particularly in the careers division, where people strongly peddle this, find your values, find what matters most to you, and let that be your prime focus. I'm often concerned that could lead to careers being shipwrecked, which concretely looks like either not being employed as an academic at all, or being employed solely as a teaching contract only role, where basically you're never paid to think, you're not sponsored to go to conferences. Many of the great privileges of being an academic become out of grasp because of inattention to brushing teeth. On the other hand, if one goes to some of the other sessions, like those particularly featured in the OB division, where people get up and they're really hardcore, you got to brush this teeth in this way and that way, and all these rules of the game, people can often be stunned and daunted. And I think an academic career could become quite meaningless if we're too focused on being instrumental on the rules of the game and everything you've got to go and do. So the idea I've had is to try and consciously and routinely balance what are the teeth that need to be brushed and what am I really passionate about here, what am I interested in, what do I value, and always try and keep both of those on the table with each facet of an academic career. For example, in research, we might say, what issues am I really interested in? But hang on, what issues are of interest to the field? What research methods would they find acceptable, etc.? And so basically, not proceeding just because we think this is the latest hot topic that will appear in a hot journal. No, what is their genuine interest in, and what will instrumentally be valuable to the relevant stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Similarly with teaching. We say, well, I'm interested in these topics. I like teaching this way. I think that's all good and well. But on the other hand, what do the students need to learn? How do they like to be taught? What's the sweet spot intersection between the way I like to do it, what the situation requires? Similarly with service at our institution, and I believe many others, is now a strong focus on engagement. And engagement means engagement within the institution and engagement externally. So I think to approach it as a box-ticking exercise would not be functional, and it would just engender cynicism in oneself. Yet on the other hand, I think saying, what am I really interested in, and yet what would be valuable to advancing the organisation's mission, and therefore be valued, and really trying to simultaneously answer those two questions, I think could be a good general heuristic for managing one's career.
You were talking about actually both poles, but one pole clearly was the question of what am I passionate about, and is there anything that currently fascinates you where you say, that's a pretty neat and new idea, or something I'd like to get my head around? Anything that you currently kind of have at the center of your attention?
There's a book I read a few years ago that I've recommended many people read and I've run workshops on. It's by Chip and Dan Heath, and it's called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. And there's a range of ideas in there I quite like. The overarching metaphor for the book is that we are like a person trying to ride an elephant along a path. Our conscious intentions to achieve a certain goal or make a certain change, they're embodied in the rider. The elephant is the embodiment of our emotions, our instincts, our inclination to follow the crowd, to be lazy, to be fickle, all of this sort of stuff. And then the path are the cues and stimuli we have around us, which also often guide us in unconscious and powerful kind of ways to act in particular ways. And what I like here is the idea that if change is ever going to happen at the individual or group or the organisation level, it's more likely to occur if we can align the rational instructions to the rider, the feelings and emotions of the elephant, and the shape of the path. So the book has 3 directions for the rider, 3 directions for motivating the elephant, 3 for the path. But one for the rider that I particularly like, and I think they call it, how do you find the bright spots? So an example of this idea, there was a guy called Jerry Sternan, who in the 1980s went to Vietnam, and he saw mass poverty and malnutrition and all of this. So there was poor sanitation, lack of water, and others had come before and written up great reports about the billions that needed to be invested to address all of these issues. He adopted a quite different approach that I find very inspiring. What he did was, he had a pair of scales, and he weighed hundreds of the kids that he met. He found those that of certain ages were heavier than the other kids. And the question is, what did their mums do differently? So what he did was spend some time and observed in a quite anthropological way what was going on. And he discovered that some of the mothers violated the norms of those communities in ways that work really well. For example, the traditional way to feed children was to give them the best available, softest rice twice a day. And if they weren't hungry at that time, or that was okay, someone else could eat it. The mothers with the less malnourished children violated these norms in several ways. Number one, they fed them twice as much, half as much, but twice as often. So like the others, they didn't have that much more food, but they gave them to on a different schedule. They also didn't give them an option of not eating the food. Here's the food, eat it. And third, what they did was collected shrimp from the surrounding rice paddies that were traditionally considered only adult food, and they gave it to their kids as well. Now, of course, we can readily imagine that that would mean a source of protein that the others weren't getting, but this was actually quite a novel thing. And here's the important point, not what they were doing differently, but what he did with the information. One could imagine running back to a first world country and trying to get an A-star hit with this information. Instead, what he did was organise community groups where 10 mothers would go out with one of the mothers who had these alternative, positively deviant practices and help the other 9 mothers find the shrimp. They'd wash their hands together, they'd cook together, they'd feed their children together. And then it was a way of really getting these better ideas to spread within the community. So this idea of saying, what would work better than the way we usually do things, and how could we get that idea into action? I think that's something that I'm very excited about. So it was a real privilege a couple of months ago to spend a week in New York with an organisation called PCI Media Impact. It's applied these sort of principles around the globe and apparently reached more than 1 billion people over the last couple of decades with these sort of pro-social, life-enhancing messages about surviving malnutrition or lack of drinking water, or one of the recent foci has been on surviving Ebola. And what they do is collect these stories of things that have worked really well or lessons that have been learnt, and they work them into serial dramas, so they could be on the radio or they could be on television, and then they supplement them with talkback, where people talk, oh, I can identify with that, oh, it's not so easy, oh, what are you talking about? So they stir up community debates about issues, about how do you avoid AIDS, how do you survive Ebola, how do you get access to clean drinking water, how can you get girls to have education as well as boys. So one of the ones with Ebola featured, there was a story of an ambulance driver who got a call out to pick up a child who was suspected of having Ebola. So he put on his head-to-toe personal protective gear. He went and picked up the child, but the protective gear got a hole in it. A couple of days later, he had Ebola. And so he describes in a video on their website about the incredible pain that he had for about 3 days. And then, so as soon as it happened, he locked himself in his ambulance, segregated himself from his family. He took himself to the Ebola camp, had amazing pain for 3 days, but then progressively got better, and now he's completely fine. And what he does is talk about the importance of following take it seriously, because a lot of people in Liberia where this happened don't believe in it. So he tells them that it's real, tells them how to avoid it, but tells them if you get it, if you seek treatment, it's not necessarily a death sentence. And what we need to do is help people to recognize it, follow the protocol, and get through it rather than being superstitious about it. Another character they talk about was a guy on the radio who said he wanted to help with Ebola, but then when he was told at short notice he was going to interview someone who had survived it and had it, he tried to claim that he was sick and ran away. He was so afraid that he'd get it. But he felt pressure because he'd agreed to the interview, so he did the interview. And then the story is not that interview, but the story is he was petrified. But then he looked into the facts of the matter. He learned that once people have had Ebola, they're not contagious anymore. Therefore, we should accept them back into our workplaces, into our friendship groups, into our churches, and all of this sort of stuff. So the idea of finding mechanisms for sharing these life-enhancing stories, I think that's really exciting. So I spent a week with them. I spent a day going through my growth mindset workshop, and then the next few days working with these folks on how they could use growth mindset principles in liaising with their program partners around the world who develop these serial dramas. And ultimately I hope to try and work with them on how we could get explicit growth mindset messages into the serial dramas that PCI Media Impact does. So that's kind of the aspirational long-term plan for me.
Thank you very much for this kind of to come to an end. Anything you would like to share about impressions you had of Vienna? Was there anything that was most striking for you? You are here with your family, and I can imagine this is quite a change from the scenery in Sydney, especially at this time of the year in November, December. Anything that you found interesting, remarkable that you would like to share?
Well, it's not. I don't think there's anything surprising to me because I, frankly, hadn't really researched what to expect. But what strikes me is it's extremely modern and sophisticated, and it's very a very developed society which seems to have prospered from the fact that it spent money on things other than war, and it's just a privilege to be here. The collegiality, the extent to which scholarship is taken seriously but not too seriously. So, teeth are always on everyone's mind, but they do things other than brush them. It's a great place to be, and it's a privilege to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us and for sharing your insight.
My pleasure.